and welcome to another episode of Practical Astrology 101. If you're new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I help justice-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. And one of the tools I use is Astrology. I will link the playlist, but we are getting towards the end of our Practical Astrology 101 series, and today I wanted to talk about transiting aspects. The way I think about transiting aspects is that they are evolving planetary conversations. So when we talked about aspects in a previous video, we were looking at them in the natal chart, static essentially, a snapshot of where the aspects are at the time that you're born. And when we look at aspects in this way, we can see how energy naturally flows in your personality. We also have covered how planets move in a video on transits. And today we're going to combine those two ideas, talk about transiting aspects. So if you haven't seen the first two, I'll go back and check those out. Before we get started, just a couple of quick notes. One is that I want to just remind you, if you missed it, that I do now have a blog you can check out at queermagical.com, and I'll be writing more about astrology as we go. And so I would love for you to check that out and to subscribe to my newsletter if you want to get updates on when there are new posts. Of course, you can feel free to leave a comment below with any astrological topics that you'd like me to write about or cover here on YouTube. And then the second note is just that you'll notice you're not seeing my face right now, you're seeing a chart. So today I'm actually going to be using my own birth chart in the video, but there will be also a wrap-up video that's coming up pretty soon where I'll be putting everything together and using charts from folks who are supporters of my work. And so if you're interested in that and how you can become a supporter for sustaining supporters, one of the benefits that I provide is the opportunity to have your chart used for educational purposes, and you can check out the link to the Patreon down below for that. And then the third little note is actually correction from the transits video. I just wanted to correct myself. I talked about out of bounds in that video, out of bounds planets, as a deviation from the ecliptic. And I got a little mixed up. That was incorrect. It's actually about deviation from the celestial equator. So just a real quick explanation of that. I talked about the kind of metaphor of the middle line of a track going round and round, and that's the sun. That middle line is the celestial equator, and that is the equator of the Earth if you were to project it out into space. The ecliptic is the apparent orbit of the sun as we move around it, and eclipses happen when the moon crosses over it. So I think I made a reference to eclipses into the ecliptic. It's actually the celestial equator for out of bounds. So I just wanted to make that correction real quick. Okay, so let's get into transiting aspects. Now, the aspects themselves do not change. So we're still talking about the same aspects: conjunctions, squares, oppositions, trines, sextiles, and they all have the same basic meaning that they do when you're looking at a natal chart. Transiting planets also have their basic meaning, but since it's not just about your own chart, those meanings can adjust slightly. And so, for example, you might hear folks talking about transiting Venus as maybe representing, someone coming into your life, a potential partner. I don't generally like to simplify quite that much, but that's a common association. So in your natal chart, you might look at, for example, Venus would show you something about how you draw things into you and where you find beauty and creativity, and might show you things about how you relate to others. With transiting Venus, you might be looking at, it's possible it could be a relationship, but it's also possible that, something is happening in your life that references, a beautiful occurrence or something creative, or, other Venus significations that are coming in. Or, if you look at Mercury in your chart, if you're looking at the natal chart, we're looking at, how do you communicate? How do you process information, etc. If you're looking at transiting Mercury, it might be a conversation, it might be a document, it might be other things that are related to Mercury, but because it's an ephemeral thing, because it's a temporary thing, transits come into your life and then leave your life, they might be a little bit different. It might be about how you're communicating in the moment. Another example, sometimes transiting Saturn will be referred to as, this could be an older person, this could be an elder that's showing up in that area of your life, whereas that wouldn't really make sense in a natal chart. So with the transit, the energy is going to be temporary, so you might notice it or intentionally work with it for a period of time. It can be an opportune moment or a kind of activation of what's already in your birth chart, already in your natal chart. So particularly when you have a planet that is transiting over a significant point in your chart, it can light up that point or planet and the aspects to it and everything that's in there natally with the transit. On the flip side, with a transiting aspect, it might boost up or activate an area of the chart, but you don't have a whole life to work with that energy. So, for example, I have a whole lifetime to work with what it means to have Mercury in Pisces, but if Mercury is going through Virgo, that's a relatively short transit. I mean, it happens fairly frequently, each year, but it's a shorter period of time. So when you are reading transits, you're typically going to be using a biwheel. So what you're seeing right now is an example of a biwheel, and it may look a little different depending on what software you're using. You can use astro.com for this. I'm using a software called Luna, which is a cloud-based astrology software that I like. Not sponsored or anything, it's just what I use. And so yeah, if you're seeing something slightly different, don't worry about it. But most softwares, most sites will allow you to display the transits on top of your own chart. So that's what we're seeing here. This is a biwheel where the inner circle of the chart is actually my natal chart, and the houses are aligned to my natal houses. So you're seeing, for example, because I'm a Cancer rising, you're seeing Cancer over here on the left. And then the outer wheel, that's showing the transit. So that's showing where are the planets in the sky right now as I'm recording this at 9:25 p.m. on August the 4th in the Olympia area in Washington State, USA. So when you pull this up, just keep in mind that that's how you're reading it, and especially keep in mind that like the ascendant here is your ascendant. So for example, if we look to see, if we want to ask ourselves, is it nighttime? Is it daytime? We want to look for where the sun is. Well, this is the actual horizon in the sky right now. So the sun in this one is just set. But we're looking here, we're not looking at my horizon in my chart. So that's just a little bit of orienting you to what we're looking at here. So there's two different types of transiting aspects that we'll be discussing. There are transiting aspects that make transiting planets, I should say, making aspects with each other. So that you may see called a mundane transit. You may see it called a transiting aspect. You may see it referred to as planet X is transiting planet Y in the sky. And that's going to be energy that affects everyone. So you can see where does it fall in your own chart, what house, but everyone's going to have that particular transiting aspect. So as an example, I'm recording this where we actually just had the exact conjunction that a lot of folks were talking about of Uranus, Mars, and the North Node. You can see that over here on the outer wheel. So Uranus and the North Node are at 18, and Mars has just gone a couple degrees past at 20. So that's what's happening in the sky. So that everyone is experiencing that conjunction of moving planet with, in this case with a node with a point. So everybody's going to have this energy, but I particularly had this energy in my 11th house. So that's where the mundane transit kind of comes down into your own life, and you can read about the energies that are happening, which you'll often be able to find for free, folks talking about various transiting aspects. And then you can say, well, where does that hit in my chart? So in my case, it's in the 11th house. So these kinds of like really aggressive, kind of rebellious, like dramatic energies for me are happening around my dreams of the future and my visions and my hopes and maybe my communities and groups, which totally tracks. I got an unexpected invitation that relates a lot to what my future is going to be. And I won't say any more about that, but it made me laugh because it was like, oh, of course. Another example you may have heard, I've talked about before, the square between Saturn and Uranus. That's kind of a longer term transit. And you can see that Saturn here is in my 8th house, and then Uranus is transiting my 11th. So for me, these energies are playing out between these two houses. For you, it might be your 10th and your 7th, or your 9th and your 6th. So it's going to vary for everyone. Then you have transiting planets that are making aspects to the natal chart. So you'll hear this described as, transiting planet name. Let's say transiting Saturn is aspecting your natal, let's say Venus. You might say, transiting X to natal Y, or X is transiting my Y. Saturn is transiting my Venus. This is going to be specific to you. And so with the very slow planets, you know that everyone in a particular generation is going to have the same thing. So like what I mean by that is, for example, Pluto, right? So so my Pluto is down here in Scorpio. So when there is a Scorpio transit, like the moon just left it, everyone roughly my age, the moon just went over their Pluto. Saturn, for people around my age, is going to be in late Scorpio, so the moon's about to go over our Saturn, right? So there is this collective energy even to transits to your birth chart, in the sense that with those slower moving planets, you have a generation of people who are going to experience the same things being hit. But again, still, the house is going to vary by person. And again, this can really like emphasize some of the natal aspects that you have in your chart. So like when we look here at this, we already mentioned this little cluster, you might even say clusterfuck, that's happening in Taurus. Well, you might also notice that I have my North Node and Ceres, an asteroid. We haven't talked about asteroids, but that's what that symbol is. I have these very close, or really right where this is happening. And so for me, this transit is also, not only are they transiting each other in the sky, they're making a conjunction, they're also making a conjunction to my chart. And so I'm going to experience this in a very specific way, and maybe in a stronger way than some people would, because of that relationship. Or you can look at, you can also look at planets, you can look at planets transiting points, transiting other planets. So like here we have Neptune is currently transiting my midheaven, which is a point. You can see 25, Pisces. So that's another example. Now, this is actually, I think this topic is where we can get into a little bit, this is called Practical Astrology 101, get into the practical bit of, well, should you pay attention? Sure, I'm going to teach you this, but when do you care? How many transits do you want to pay attention to? Because of course, the sky is always changing. If we looked at every time the moon went over Pluto, for example, that would be roughly every month. And most folks are probably not going to do that. And so personally, I tend to limit it a lot. It's really going to be a personal choice, how There's the practical element of how much space in your day do you have to pay attention to this. But there's also, a functional sort of, what do you want astrology to do for you? And how much are you focused on some of the transiting, what's happening in the sky, how things change, versus just kind of looking at how your natal chart is playing out in general. Personally, I limit it a lot, and so I look at the bigger themes, especially I tend to pay attention with mundane transits. I'm going to be looking at outer planets to outer planets. So like Saturn squaring, roughly, Uranus. Well, those are two big, slow-moving planets, and thus, when they're transiting each other, that lasts a long time. So this square has been more or less in and out of orb for a couple of years. And that's going to be not only a collective energy, but something that we're each experiencing somewhere in our own chart for a while. I'll also sometimes look at transits to my own chart. Either if I'm trying to find good energy for something, I might look for a particularly fortuitous thing. Or more often, when I'm looking to understand and maybe mitigate something or to see the possibility in something, I will sometimes check and just say like, oh, is anything happening transiting my chart? So again, with like the bigger planets, I might pay more attention. Personally, I tend to kind of at the beginning of each year do a little bit of practice seeing what's happening for the year ahead. And so I know that like Neptune's been hanging out on my Mercury and my midheaven for quite a while because it's so slow. And so that is like, does have a bigger sort of energetic theme over a few years of what that feels like. I might also look at things like, okay, knowing that Jupiter is transiting my 10th house for a bit, because it's one of the slower planets. Looking at Saturn as transiting my 8th, those are general things that I might pay attention to. And then, like I said, if something is coming up, so like the other day, not gonna lie, had a real emotional day, and then I looked, and this it was when a couple days ago. So when Mars Uranus was exact right there, and I was like, oh, of course, it's like literally these three are all exact. That's some really like strong disruptive kind of energy. Of course, I'm like super emotional and irritated and all this stuff. So that can sometimes be just like kind of validating. And then you can look for like, how would I mitigate that? So with some of the skills we've already learned, are there any supportive aspects? Is there anything, quote unquote, nice? Are there any trines or sextiles that maybe I could lean into a little bit to get, to mitigate the effect of this? So you may, it's really a philosophical choice again, what you want to pay attention to, but you can learn about the current mundane transits on something like the Astrology podcast, or many other, honestly, astrology podcasts or astrology blogs, and get a sense for what other astrologers are thinking. You can read, like horoscopes often will have some of this. You can also use something like the Honeycomb Collective makes these almanacs where you can actually purchase spiral bound or digital. There may be actually multiple bindings. Mine's spiral bound, but you can get an almanac that is personalized to your chart, and so you can actually see, and it's all color coded. You can decide what to include. It's really a cool service. Where you can customize. And so like you may choose to look at the slower moving planets. You may choose to look at a particular planet's transits that you're interested in. And so, for example, I like to pay attention to the perfection lord for the year, which is a Hellenistic technique where it's outside the scope of this video, but I'll just tell you that mine is the sun this year. And so I'm paying a little more attention to like, okay, the sun's in my second house right now. The sun, like, when the sun, it just did. When the sun transited my moon, I might look at that a little more heavily this year. Whatever you choose to do, just like don't get overwhelmed. If you find yourself, and this definitely happened to me, like if you find yourself feeling like, oh my God, is this happening, and like how does it affect things? I really personally find that like living out your experience, having your embodied experience, and then checking the chart to see how they relate can be supportive. If you're really stressed out about different transits, I would just put it down and don't worry about it. What I do like philosophically, though, about transiting aspects is the way that they highlight the dynamic nature of our lives. Nothing is permanent. Different energies have different durations. So, you have these slower moving planets that have longer slower stories to tell. You have these faster planets as well. Nothing is permanent in life, and different energies are going to have different durations, like I said. So, we can choose to work with those energies, or we can choose not to work with those energies. Personally, I believe that, it might show what's going on. You can look at an astrological chart to see what's going on, but you are at choice. You can't make the transit go away, and sometimes working with a transit can actually help to mitigate it. It can help, if a difficult transit is happening, sometimes channeling that energy into a more positive or neutral signification of that transit can be a way to work with it. But you're not required to do X because the transit is happening. And in fact, sometimes you'll find that you expect something to happen and it does not go that way. So like looking at my second house and transits happening to my second house, I might say, ooh, this is when like a spotlight is being shown on money and maybe I'll make a lot of money. But maybe that's not what it is. Maybe it's the spotlight is being shown on my values. So there's multiple ways that anything can play out, as we've covered. Every house, every planet, even every aspect has like different significations or the ways it can play out, and that's just going to vary. Transits also, affect different natal things about us. So if you in your natal chart already have, let's say, a propensity towards anger, then maybe Mars transits are going to light that up, or going to fire you up, whereas for somebody else it might be more irritation, or it might be more drive, is what comes up. So how long a transiting aspect lasts, of course, is going to depend on the planet, how fast it moves. You can refer to the video on transits in general to see the durations, but as an example, I mentioned Neptune. So like I'm going to move this chart around by years. So if I go back 1 year from today, you can see Neptune looks like it's barely moved. It's moved 3 degrees. Go back another year, it's still right on my Mercury. So this is like multiple years that Neptune's hanging out in this area. So that's like a year at a time. You see it's moving 2 degrees or 3 degrees. Not that much. Especially with the outer planets, you'll also notice that the retrograde kills a lot of their forward momentum. So as they move, we can take Neptune as an example. Let's actually update to now. So right now you can tell, because in this software it's red if it's retrograde. So right now Neptune's retrograde. So let's move forward a month at a time. And so you'll see right now Neptune is apparently moving backward. Okay, it's gonna did I go backwards? I meant to go forwards. Okay, yeah, here we are in July. So right here in June, Neptune stationed retrograde. So it moves backwards. It's at 25. It's at 25 still. It's at 24. So it's, starting to gain a little in reverse. And then it's going to turn around again. And you can see there now it's at 22. Now it's at 23. So even though it does ultimately, on the whole, progress forward, it only makes it 27 before it turns around again. And so with those slower moving planets, you'll notice that they can't get very far because they keep getting pulled back. The length of a transit through a sign or over a point also depends on where that planet is in its orbit. So how long it's, let's say, transiting to your chart, well, it's going to depend, is the planet that's transiting in a slower or faster part of its orbit. So, for example, if you have planets, let's say, in Gemini, in the second half of 2022, you're going to notice, and I'll advance the chart to show you this. So Mars jumps into Gemini in September, but watch, it's going to go forward more and then there it is. It's stationed retrograde. So it gets through Gemini, and then it's going to go backwards. So if you have anything in Gemini, you'll see Mars. It's going to hit it, and then it's going to go forward again. Hit it, hit it, hit it. And if you have something right around, the slowest part, if you have something where the retrograde stations exactly, it may hang out there for a while depending on which planet it is and how slow the planet is. By contrast, a lunar aspect is only going to be a few hours. A solar aspect is only going to be a few days. So astrologers will also vary about how long they would say that a transiting aspect, quote unquote, counts. And that's the orb. So we talked briefly about orbs in the first video on aspects. I didn't really go into it. And that's because everyone has their own opinion. Like all different traditions, different astrologers have their own opinion of how big an orb you should use based on what planet it is, based on the technique. So like, are you looking at transits? Are you looking at a birth chart? Are you looking at elections, which we aren't covering here? Sometimes look at whether it's an applying or a separating aspect. There's all these different things that might be considered, and different orbs. So if I look here, we are next March. So like there's my birthday. And so you can, let's go back by weeks with the sun. And so, some astrologers might say that my solar return, starts here. Some might say it starts here. Wait, not exactly, but, how close does the sun have to get to my sun for it to start feeling like the energy? And I think the best way to do this, honestly, is to just feel into yourself. Do you notice your energy changing? I actually think right now, what's going on with Mars and Uranus might be a really good way to like feel this out for yourself in terms of, how close did Mars have to get before you started feeling a little stressed out? Or you could also look at, there's a T-square, which is an aspect pattern where you get multiple squares, where we had one with Mercury. Let's go back a little. So we had one with Mercury when it was, right about there. So you'll see that Uranus is at 18, Saturn at 23. Again, if you were using a very tight orb, you wouldn't say that this was a square, but let's assume that 5 degrees does count as a square. So this is a square because there's 90 degrees between here and here. And then the T is Mercury. So with Mercury at 19. So they're all kind of close. I noticed that I started feeling, as soon as Mercury entered Leo, stuff started going a little haywire. But then the haywireness kind of melted a little bit quicker when it was leaving the aspect, when it was separating. So this is the concept of applying and separating. So the general principle with any aspect is that it's going to be the strongest energy when it's exact. So, for example, if we look at the exact conjunction that we've been talking about, that day, where maybe it's 2 days, where they're all at 18, that's going to be the height of that energy of all three together. But, that's just the strongest point. And so you will, if we go back a little, you can see Mars start to approach. Let's go back a little more. Okay. So like at this point, most people would say Mars is not in orb. There's no aspect being made yet. But as Mars gets closer, go a week forward, right? Okay, now it's starting to get kind of close to so you might start to feel it. And then if we go, let's go day by day, it gets closer, it gets closer. So it's like this energy, whatever the energy is, whatever transiting aspect we're talking about, you see the moon comes in there as well. But whatever we're talking about, it's getting stronger and stronger and stronger until they are together. So we would call this applying. we would say Mars is applying to, and in this case, there's two things. So it's applying to this conjunction that's already present between Uranus and the North Node. It's applying, and then it's going to go exact at 18. And so often the applying is more emphasized. I think in part, or it kind of makes sense because, right, this is a time where you can maybe prepare, right? You know Mars is coming, right? And so you can be like, okay, it's coming. It hasn't happened yet. Like, it's building energy, but I can work with it. And then the separating is often when the results of that transit become more clear. So when Mars starts to go past. So that's where we are right now. You can see Mars went 19, 20, and so it's moving away. And so a lot of folks will use a bigger orb applying and a shorter orb separating. If you've ever heard the terms like retro shade, sometimes people say, so like Mercury retrograde, they'll say like the shadow period. Like that's the period right before and right after the retrograde. And it's the same principle here. That a transit is not just the moment where it's exact, it's either side. It's also important to note that retrogrades mean that an aspect repeats. And so you can either, whenever you have a planet that's transiting your natal chart, you can actually get that energy of that activation happening once or 3 times. So I can show you an example of this. Probably the best one would be, let's go back a little bit. So an example of this with my chart would be, yeah, okay. So take a look at Neptune. So as we go forward, Neptune gets closer and closer to my midheaven. That's the MC. You'll see right here, it's exact 25. Okay, it's stationed retrograde on the midheaven. So in this case, it's just sitting on my midheaven for a while. And so that might be like, oh, that's activated. Neptune on my midheaven. It might be confusion around my impact, confusion around what impact I meant to have on the world in public, may come up. There may also be dreams and visions about that, right? There's positive and negative associations. But let's look for contrast at, sorry, I'm doing this on the fly, so I'm just trying to think of a good example. So let's take a look at, keep going. A different example. I'm keeping an eye on Jupiter. And I think Jupiter retrogrades. Oh, I might be wrong. Okay, better plan. Mercury. All right, I'm going to do one that was in the past because I know this happened. Didn't prep for this in advance. So if I go back a little, we will get to 2020. And I think this is going to be a better one because I believe, yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, so what we're going to do is we're actually looking, this was the Mars, so Mars had a retrograde in 2020. So now we're looking at July 2020. You'll see Mars up here at the top of the chart. And notice my Mars and Venus. So in this case, Mars went over my Mars and Venus right here. So here it is at 20. So that's like your first hit, your first like experience of the energy. But then it goes past and it turns around. So now 23, so now you see it's passing back over, goes to 15. So it went backwards over. So often when this happens, the energy of it can be like, okay, I think I know what's going on, or like I'm experiencing the first taste of it. Then it turns around and I'm like, oh wow, that actually wasn't what I expected. Or, there might be some like revisions that you need to do. Or it may just be another try, another chance. And then it goes forward again. what's really interesting, because this happened already, so I know what was going on there, is that this is my 10th house of career. And if we go back again, I'll tell you narratively what happened in those months is that, when Mars was passing over, that was in the summer, and like everything was going, pretty okay. Like that summer of, it wasn't great. It was 2020, right? But like I was getting things done. I was doing my job. And then we turn around, and this time actually, October, this was right when like I started psychic channeling. I started getting messages and realizing that the career path I was on, that I had been on for an entire decade, wasn't right. So that happened as Mars was going retrograde over my Mars and my Venus. And then it came back. And this is where I really started building the vision for this current business, is as it was passing back over in December. And so that's like a really good example of how that can hit you, where it's like, okay, we're going, it's just going to be like Mars on my Mars and Venus. It's going to be like some extra energy in my career and like bringing things to me. Like, that's great. And then it hits again and you're like, oh no, it's actually going to blow everything up. So that can happen. Now, so that's the idea of the retrograde. I would say in general with transiting aspects that I especially like to pay attention to the houses that are involved. So I already mentioned that with a mundane transit, the houses are what kind of brings it down into your own chart. I like to look at the relationship between the emphasis in those houses. So for example, let's go back to now. When we look at Saturn and we look at Uranus squaring each other in my chart, well, I'm looking now at what does it mean when my 8th house is getting activated, and getting activated specifically by Saturn. If there's challenges, delays, slowdowns, these are some of the kind of energies that Saturn can bring. It could be related to institutions or like other institutions that are present that are affecting my 8th house topics for me. And then, so this would be topics like, other people's resources. So it might be like, if I was expecting, support from someone, and then that's like getting delayed. And then how is that in relationship with Uranus? Maybe like shakeups and surprises, etc., around my visions, my hopes, and my dreams. Well, that very much actually tracks for me. It makes sense for me because, I am in a place where I am, doing a business that is very much about my hopes and dreams and visions, and then I have a vision for the future of my business, and that's kind of squaring off a little bit against having to like temper my expectations of how I receive income and how I even how I like work with. Sometimes 8th house I think can like bring up scarcity in general, and so like loss and scarcity, like, okay, I've got this dream for the future, but like how am I going to handle when things are a little bit more lacking resource wise? What can I do? How can I be creative from that space that's coming up for me? So that's just an example of how those houses might be in conversation with each other. And then when you have transits to your natal chart, I think of it as the change in this case is coming from the house with the transiting planet, and then the house with the natal planet is receiving the change. And so the story often tends to kind of play out in that natal or receiving house. So an example of that might be if we look at, what's a good one here? Yeah, let's look at Venus at 21 Cancer compared to my Mercury at 22 Pisces. So that's a trine. So the transit, like where the energy is coming from, well, it might be, some, Venus is generally a pretty positive energy. So, something like beautiful or even, so first house can include things around the body. So it could be like in health. So it could even be like something where, you know, oh, I don't know. That seems kind of silly that like I was about to say like that I'm beautiful. No, that doesn't make any sense. Let's say though, okay, think about like the first house as having a lot to do with like the self and the identity. So maybe it's that you know, a new like kind of more positive outlook around myself or my identity is now in supportive relationship and bringing supportive energy to the way that I'm communicating ninth house, you know, communicating about like philosophical or spiritual topics. That actually makes sense for me right now, that, you know, the more I'm loving up on myself, so kind of like this could be like self-love, right? It's a, you know, a time with like more self-love. Well, that is feeding my, you know, making me more able. In fact, I've been like writing some poetry, so you can kind of see all those things coming together. You know, Mercury in Pisces loves poetry. You know, being about spiritual, philosophical, sort of meaning of life topics. That's ninth house, and then it's being fed or resourced by greater self-love and greater sort of like seeing the beauty in the way I am. Has helped with that. So that's just an example of how the energy from here is playing out in the ninth, in the way I'm communicating and writing, and particularly Mercury communicating and writing, and particularly on topics that are like philosophical, spiritual, you know, ninth house. With a conjunction, it's more just kind of like, you know, yes, hi, hello, you cannot use this energy without this other thing being present. So like anything I do, you know, related to my midheaven is automatically going to contain some Neptunian energy. So when you have a transiting conjunction like this, where a transiting planet is going right over something, then it feels that way. Keep in mind that transits are not just conjunctions. We've been talking about conjunctions, but you can also look at a transiting square, a transiting trine, a transiting anything. So this was an example of Venus is transiting trine my Mercury. Hope that makes sense. If you any confusion about identifying those, leave a comment below. I do pay a lot of attention personally to transits, to the angles of my chart, just because I do find that they tend to be pretty noticeable. So for example, this Neptune here, but also like if I go back a little, you know, when Venus passed over, I lost Venus. Oh, there it is. So when Venus there passed over, go forward, my ascendant, my rising, right around here, I noticed that. Like that was right around the new moon in Leo. It was like sparkly energy. So that like beautiful Venus energy going right over my ascendant was like, yes. Things might go over your descendant and you're really like noticing what's happening in relationships, or what even like comparisons you're making, or what seems kind of far away. When things pass over your IC, you might just you know, notice those transits in your private life, in what is, you know, settling or comforting you. When it goes over your MC, more in your public life and the impact you're making. And so I like to pay attention to those. Now, the very last topic is returns. So you may have heard of the Saturn return. A lot of people have heard of the Saturn return. It's not just a return, though. So these are what we call planetary phases. And the idea here is a phase is a relationship between, it's really like a point in a cycle, and it's the relationship between the transiting planet's whole cycle from being conjunct that same planet in your chart to being conjunct again. And so what I mean by that is you can look at a fast moving planet to make this really obvious. Look at the moon. Let's bring the moon back a little. Okay, so you'll see, you know, the moon will pass over my moon. Keeps going. There it is down at the bottom. It's going to keep going. It's going to keep going. Now it's going to be at the top. And then it's going to pass over my moon again. So in the course of a month, you know, it's going to go around. And so you can, oh, there, we landed right on it, August 22nd. So this is like my exact lunar return Now, lunar returns, some people do use these, and they can be particularly sparkly days, but they happen every month. So typically you're going to be looking at the slower moving planets for that. We're actually going to be covering the moon in the next video, and so this may absorb a little more when we talk about the moon, but basically, you know, like I said, phase is a point in the cycle, and we tend to look at the return, the square, the opposition, and then another square and the return. So we tend to look at those hard aspects just because they're often more dramatic, to be honest. And they're emphasized, we would emphasize them with the outer planets. So some people do look at like their Venus return, their Mars return, but I tend to really focus more on outer planets. And in particular, although you do have some of the planets further out, so for example, the Uranus opposition is an important point. I think it's around age 42. We look a lot at Jupiter and Saturn just because of their frequency, as well as the nodes, but I'm going to focus here on Jupiter and Saturn. So the return is like a turning point or a next level in the natal story. So if we look at, we're going to go back a little and we're going to look at Saturn. So we actually go back to my Saturn return, which is a while ago. I'm not as young as some of you. And I'm perfectly okay with that. But my Saturn return happened, it was 14, I think, 15. Yeah, okay. Oh, here it is, exact. So you notice 28, 28. Okay, so this point in my life, and this was actually one where it went back and forth, so it was a triple hit. Sometimes you go to triple hit on your return. But around this time, summer 2015, was when I was experiencing a level up, a next chapter in the story of my Saturn. And so you can look at the house and kind of expect that in that area of your life, for me it's the 5th house, in the area of pleasure, joy, creativity, I was experiencing things differently. I was getting a boost of something different and new. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's all over the place. You know, whatever it is, it tends to be pretty noticeable. And then as we move away from that return, so Saturn returns happen approximately ages 29, around like 59, 60. So usually you have two. Whereas Jupiter returns happen every 12 years. So here we are in 2015. If I keep going, then I'll hit a Saturn square. And in fact, I am right about there now. So there we are. So 2020, you can see, actually it was retrograde at that moment, but you can, well, no, let's bring it. Oh no, sorry, I got that wrong. Actually, I want to go all the way into Aquarius. There we are. Okay, into Aquarius. So 20, that's right. I was going to say, I'm pretty sure I'm coming up on it. So here we are in 2022. Right now, Saturn, I don't think made it quite there. So we're looking for 28 again, because that's where my natal Saturn is at 28 Scorpio. So now we're looking at Aquarius, because that's, again, the same modality. It's a fixed sign, and so that's a square. And you can go back to the aspects video if you've forgotten how to find that. So 21 is getting closer and closer to the square. 23, 25. But you can see it's slowing down, and there it is. It's stationed retrograde in the summer. So it actually hasn't hit my opening square yet. It's going to go back, which means I'm pretty sure that I'm only going to have a single hit this time, because it's going to go back and it's going to go forward again. So I don't actually have the exact hit of that opening square until next February. So, you know, stay tuned for how that feels. You can have that, though, where it almost gets there and then doesn't quite make it, and you can still sort of start to feel a little bit of the energy. So with that opening square in a planetary phase cycle, it's going to introduce some dramatic tension. It's going to introduce something new, you know, a little more pressure, a little more dramatic tension when it gets all the way around. So it'll get over here. In Taurus, the opposition is like a point of pulling away from that natal position. And then the closing square is another round of sort of dramatic tension before we get to the next level of the story. And so if you are able to notice the themes of the return, that can help you a little bit with what to expect. So for example, if we look at my Jupiter, so this is the other one that I like to focus on, Jupiter return. So So my Jupiter return should be around here. Jupiter, we want to go back slightly. So my Jupiter natally is at 5 Aquarius. So you can see it's right around the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. So this is another thing when you look at the returns, they can be flavored by other transiting aspects. So here it's like these two, that's a big deal in the sky. It's happening very close to my Jupiter. And so when my Jupiter return hit, Saturn was, a little bit behind, basically right on top, like 2 degrees away. You'll also notice Pluto not that far away. Like, look at all this that's happening. There was like a new moon. There was, so this was pretty, like, there's a lot. So it was a complicated story. So even though I experienced a Jupiter return, and often a Jupiter return is spoken of as a kind of, Sam Reynolds is a great source for this. He talks about Jupiter return and how every 12 years it's like this like new level in kind of like, are you going to respond to the call, to a calling? Are you going to respond? But because my Jupiter is natally in Aquarius, which is a little bit of a slower energy, it's a winter sign, it's ruled by Saturn, and because Saturn is literally right here, there was a lot of Saturnian energy to my Jupiter return, and so I was sort of going, I'm not experiencing lots of luck and awesomeness yet. Like, it doesn't really feel like, this growth through transformation that I might expect from the 8th house. Growth through challenge. I was like, where's the growth? And like, I had to keep going. Jupiter's gonna get out of that house and it's gonna come back. All this period, right? I'm sitting here going, what's my Jupiter return? Like, what are we? I mean, sure, I left my job and I had expanded into a new area of and definitely a transformation into, something new, but like everything was going really slow in this period in the beginning of my business. And I was really asking myself like, wow, like it didn't like magically take off. So what's going on, Jupiter? But it wasn't until about here. So Jupiter is almost out of the sign when it was like, oh, it clicked. And it so happened that like some of the work I'd been doing and seeding and slowly and like building up in this whole period became evident in December with an eclipse, actually, became evident that it was like, oh, what I'm actually growing in, so 8th house, other people's resources, what I was actually growing in is a totally different relationship to like giving and receiving, a different relationship to capitalism, a different relationship to scarcity and fear of loss and fear of lack. But it took a whole year to get through that, right? It wasn't right when Jupiter went over. But I can see now in retrospect how that was being seeded around that time. So it's just a note that like you don't always know and like right away. But now that I do know that, if I keep going forward, I can guess that when my Jupiter square happens, which will be in Taurus, so right around here, next December, there might be some sort of dramatic tension or some pressure. There might be some challenge to like, are you gonna incorporate those lessons? Or were those the lessons that you wanted to learn? Are there new things that you've learned? And it might feel a little aggravating. Maybe I'll have challenges around scarcity and lack. Maybe I'll be, I hope not, but maybe I'll be, tested a little bit there. Who knows? That could happen. And maybe when Jupiter comes around to the opposition, which is a few years onward, Leo, right in here, well, not quite. You can see, though, if you're watching that, so Jupiter's a little faster in this part of its cycle. What am I doing? Come on. Go into Leo. Yeah, so right around here. Yeah. July, August, so when it's right there. 2026, maybe I will, have a very different, like, maybe instead of, this is the, like, expanding and growing through lack, maybe I'll actually, like, That would be nice. Maybe I'll end up, having some abundance and my own personal resources. Second house, and maybe that will be the challenge. Is like, do I stay with the things I've learned and the lessons I've learned? If I have more material security, is my resolve tested? So that's just some examples of like how that might look, and what those planetary phases kind of could feel like. But again, checking the return. How did it feel around? And then after the return, do you have an idea of what that return was about? That can be a good way to guess what the square and the opposition and the next square, closing square, will be. Okay, so that was a lot of content. Please leave a comment below if you have any questions about any of this. And of course, if you got value out of this, if you found this educational, or if you want to just support others getting this kind of education, there is a Patreon link below, and you can check it out. Everything I do on this channel is freely available, and support is optional. And hey, in the theme of my Jupiter return in my 8th house, one of the things that I learned was around, getting a little more radical about how we can, challenge normal modes of receiving income and like sort of standard modes of business, and how can we make it more equitable and more accessible. And so this is one way I've been experimenting with doing that. So I'd love it if you wanted to check out that link below. Of course, sharing with a friend is also awesome. If you don't have the financial means, that's totally understandable. So check that out. Check out the newsletter, link below as well. And I will see you in the next video when we will be talking about the moon.